Welcome back. We are joined today by Professor Richard Wolff to discuss what is happening in the world economy. So thank you very much for coming back on.
My pleasure, Glenn. Glad to be here.
So, well, we see that power is continuing to shift to the east. The world economy is changing, and the political West seems to be less capable of competing in the new world. And I guess within this framework, we see now that the U.S. government still is shut down. U.S. is tariffing the world and also preparing to attack Venezuela for, well, either for narco-terrorism or seizing its oil. Meanwhile, in Europe, they are now talking about new ways of legalizing the theft of Russian sovereign funds, and the Dutch recently even seized a Chinese chip company, Nexperia. So, what stage of capitalism are we looking at here? Do you see
Well,
any?
yeah, no, I think about this a lot. I work on it a lot. My answer, which has to come, if you allow me, in layers a little bit as we go through it. Probably the biggest issue you've touched on yourself, which is that the dynamic center of capitalism has moved from the west to the east. It seems to me the evidence now is literally overwhelming. I know there are plenty of people who don't want to see it, but I really do now write that off to what is typical of declining empires, that the people who run them don't want to see them decline, which I understand, are frightened by the prospect of decline, which I understand, and so do something which I understand, which is to pretend it isn't happening. It reminds me of a time when my little daughter, well, we were taking her for a walk, and a dog came by and started barking, and the barking dog frightened her. Um, so she did what seemed to her to be the logical thing to do. She put her little hands in front of her eyes. No one told her to do this. She just did that because then she couldn't see the dog. And he was much less frightening because she couldn't see him. It was a moment when you realize how a human being learns after a while that the barking dog is still there even when you can't see him. And, that's a learning process. I think the United States, where I live, I'm speaking to you from New York City, the United States, where I live and work and have all my life, is in a state that psychologists call denial, in which large numbers of its people, most of its leadership, certainly the leaders of the Republican and Democratic parties, are busily engaged not only in the rather passive activity of denial, but in the more active of asserting the contrary, as if trying very hard to persuade themselves that the denial is not inappropriate, that they really don't have to worry. And I would say this as follows. the center of gravity of capitalism. The capitalism is still here in the United States. We are a capitalist society. It's true. This week, we elected for the first time a socialist as mayor of this city, which is an enormously important step and also a step in this decline. We are still certainly a capitalist country, but it isn't the dynamic center. It isn't where the technological breakthroughs are stunning and build on each other. It isn't the growth area. It isn't the market expansion. It's basically none of those things. It has a few remaining dynamic sectors. High tech in California is one of them, and so on. But the bulk of the dynamic of capitalist growth, technical, growth of output, growth of trade, that's moved east. That's now somewhere else. And it is the gap, as you know, you and I have discussed it. If you add up the GDPs of the G7, they were roughly equal to the GDP of China and the BRICS in the year 2020. And here we are almost 6 years later, and the gap gets wider each year in the favor of the East, not the West. So capitalism is in a declining situation in the West. I would argue worse in Europe than in the United States. But whichever one of those, the dynamic, the growth, the expansion, that has gone to the East. And you see the symptoms in our culture here literally every day.
Well, again, this is why I was curious. What happens when when we're no longer capable of competing? Because there seems to be these different reflexes. On one hand, throw out the rule book in terms of how international trade is supposed to be conducted, and I think you're correct as well. This ignoring reality. We do the same with the war in Europe as well. That is, the worse the war goes, the more our political class are beating their chest and escalating their own rhetoric. Uh, but you see a possible reversal in the economic situation somehow to rescue the situation, because across all the main areas, if it's the technological leadership or in industrial dominance, financial, maintaining the dominance of the US dollar or euro. Is there any path you see where the West can take to start to improve its situation?
Uh, I don't see it. I don't see a place where I can say, well, if this and this and this happen, here's a chance of evading the implications of what I have just said. And let me be a little bit concrete. The the shock that United States plus Europe arming Ukraine over a 10-year period was and funding it and weaponizing it in every way was insufficient to defeat the Russians. This is a terrible, terrible issue for them, not because they care all that much where the boundaries are. They lived for decades with NATO blocked by Eastern Europe when it was part of the Soviet system. They can live with a reduced NATO boundary. This is not a serious issue, right? And their concern for invading small countries is so laughable that you have a hard time when otherwise serious people talk like that. United States invaded Vietnam, rich, big, powerful country, poor, little country. And all of these people didn't say anything. And then the United States invaded Afghanistan, even poorer, and nobody said small. Big country invades little country. Then Iraq. I mean, this is silly. We're about to do something in Venezuela, which is what? It's an exercise in make believe. It's an exercise in affirming when you're frightened that the Monroe Doctrine is still the law of the world, and that the United States is there to enforce it and to but it is so desperate that it needs an utterly transparent pretext. I mean, this killing, I don't know how this has played out in the European press, but I know the United States. And there have now been at least 60 to 65 people, I keep some record, that have been killed in these boats, partly in the Caribbean, partly on the Pacific Ocean side of Latin America. No evidence, None. Zero. No lawyer, no jury, no judge, nothing. Summary execution by the American military. And for those who are watching this program and do not know American law, we have a terrible drug problem in this country, but we've had it for 50 years. The entirety of my life, drugs are everywhere. I can get any of the so-called illegal drugs here in New York whenever I want. When my son and daughter went to school here in the United States, public school, they were surrounded by kids who had and used drugs. They were frequently tempted themselves, as all children are. We have a serious problem. And people engaged in the drug trade are arrested every day in this country. None of them has ever been executed. The drug trade is not a capital crime in the United States. So here there were people allegedly engaged in the drug trade thousands of miles away from the United States, representing no conceivable threat, and they were summarily executed. That is grotesque as a behavior. And even supporters of Mr. Trump in this country don't know what to say. They really don't know. And when they do finally say something, it sounds like the text of a mediocre cowboy movie, of tough text. Oh, we have to get them and we have to take care of them. It is childish. Although the word childish isn't enough because you're killing human beings, and quite a few of them, with no end in time, and asserting that they are Venezuelan with no way to know who they are. You haven't looked at their papers. This is ridiculous. It is make-believe, and it is pounded on. And notice, not just by Trump, but by the vice president, by the defense secretary. They all get involved in an exercise that a humorist would call, the macho presentation in the men's locker room at the gymnasium. There's something very bizarre that is ritualistic in its form. Meanwhile, the economic situation keeps on deteriorating. It is extraordinary what we're watching. We are now here in New York waiting to see how bad the current recession, which is already underway, how bad it will get, how long it will last, which are the two great questions all recessions present at the beginning. Employment looking bad, inflation not going down, worried that the tariffs, which really haven't hit yet, are in the process of being transformed into higher retail prices. Goldman Sachs and others are out with the studies. As predicted, the importers, the American businesses who import, those are the ones who pay the tariff, by the way. And notice, Americans, starting with Mr. Trump, continue to speak in a very carefully choreographed confusion. If you listen closely, tariffs are presented as a punishment for other countries. They have cheated us. They have, fooled with us. Balance of payments data are abused in order to make that case. And so we're going to punish them with a tariff. Most Americans, my students, I teach economics. It's a subject we teach. I have to explain to my students who don't understand, having learned that tariff is a tax imposed by the U.S. government on U.S. citizens, since the U.S. government cannot impose taxes on other people's citizens. They don't understand their own president, who keeps talking about hitting the Chinese with a tariff. And then I explain to them, and then, of course, they understand. And Goldman Sachs has a nice study, they're not the only ones, that shows the pattern of shifting. They are now shifting the burden. The extra tax they have to pay, they have to recoup that somehow. And so the prices at the retail sector are going up. And that then leads, it's remarkable. Each aspect of this decline now feeds another aspect. I'll tell you a story, but it's apocryphal about this. Every year, the largest retail outlet in the United States, which is the Walmart Corporation, and I'm sure people know it all over the world, but it dominates here in the United States. We have a holiday of Thanksgiving. It comes at the end of this month of November. And traditionally, you eat a turkey, that bird, cooked up for Thanksgiving. So Walmart, as an advertisement, puts out, this year we are so proud we have a whole package. You can get everything you need, the turkey and the carrots and whatever goes with it, for this wonderful price. We've kept the price down. So this year, they, with great fanfare, rolled out the advertisement, and they compared the price this year is less than the price it was last year. And we're fighting inflation. And the President of the United States celebrated and commended Walmart publicly for its wonderful leadership in fighting inflation. At which point, every newspaper in the country, with the exception of those that are so far supporting Mr. Trump that they cannot ever do what I'm about to describe, but every other newspaper has done this. They point out that if you add up the list of items last year in the Thanksgiving box, it has 1/4 fewer items in it. That's why its price is lower. If you have the same items last year and this year, the price is significantly higher. All right, this is childish. But something like this happens in the United States now almost every day. And it keeps exposing and exposing. And the election results of last Tuesday, the complete sweep, everyone endorsed by Mr. Trump lost, and everyone opposed to Mr. Trump won. I mean, granted, it's a small number of candidates, but Virginia and New Jersey are very important states in the electoral structure of the United States, and the victory in New York City dwarfs them all, since the socialist, who was, by the way, referred to by the president not as a socialist, he corrected himself, Mr. Trump. He said it's not a socialist, it's a communist. Now, in this country, this is the equivalent of saying an emissary from the devil, complete with horns and a tail. Right? So the president denounces him, and what does he do? He gets more votes than the rest of the candidates combined. He got over 50% of the vote. It's extraordinary to live in a country that has been at the forefront of anti-leftist celebration of capitalism, going through a decline that they can't stop, that they can only theatrically respond to. It produces a level of tense division in this country. I think if you were to visit, you'd probably feel it. If you spent a few weeks here, that it feels different from the way it used to. Everybody has that. People say that to each other on the street. It is a sense of impending doom, very depressed, very anxious, and among young people, a sense of having been born at a very unlucky time. And they want change, and they want it badly. And these elections are about people by the hundreds of thousands coming out to vote who don't normally vote, only because they thought maybe somebody as different as a socialist would be worth giving a vote to. Let's see what they can do.
It seems that the former consensus around the status quo, of course, altering to some extent over the past 80 years. It's well, as the status quo disappears, the consensus goes away as well. So you see both the political right and the political left are now willing to experiment with new things. That is, on the right, they obviously roll the dice with Donald Trump, while on the left now they're trying something different in New York. But the concerning aspect though is that there is no common ground, as you said. They seem to hate each other quite intensely, and indeed the efforts to delegitimize, not through countering the arguments or defining the key problems, but just through this cheap labeling. That is, he's a commie. This is nothing good can come from this, though. But in terms of going into the core and
Glenn, if I could
yeah,
just interrupt you, because you're saying something very important, but I want to get to the punchline. I would add to what you're saying. They have nothing to say to each other because the issue is each side wants to blame the other for the decline, but cannot admit there is one, which is a very difficult task. Imagine yourself being asked, give a speech. You're the senator from somewhere. Give a speech in which you blame them for the decline of America, which everybody feels, but you're not allowed to say that there's a decline. That's the closest you can come is Mr. Trump's slogan, make America great again. You need to imagine a great past, which is fictitious, made up. I'm going to undo the falling apart. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to. So the other side is the blame. Look, Republicans say the Democrats bring immigrants in. Well, it's ridiculous, but they say that. That's a way of saying you're at fault for the decline. The whole anti-immigrant craziness in Europe as well as here is scapegoating. It's classic in its outlines. It's finding an unreal object of your anger because you can't figure out, or you have a taboo against facing what it actually is. Then the Democrats hate the Republicans because the Republican way of making America great again requires building a coalition of people who will take that idea seriously. Well, who are they? Whether the people who are, strong Christians who have to face the reality that interest in religion in the United States is on a 100-year decline. Nothing's going to change that, at least not in the foreseeable future. And it frightens the people for whom religion remains an important issue. But they're watching it disappear. It's an object of humor on the television. It's not, people don't take it seriously. And when they do, it's in a very formalistic kind of way. You suddenly see the resurgence of white supremacy. Why? Because there's a part of the population that has held on to that idea of racial hierarchy for the last 100 years, and watching it disappear slowly, gradually, but more and more. And they feel they want it back. They wouldn't say it, but they want it. And so they get together around the slogan, Make America Great Again. But what it is blaming, scapegoating all the people you didn't like anyway. And now Mr. Trump makes it possible for you to have a place at the table of the political life of this society. 2 weeks ago, he announced a decline in the amount of people who will be allowed into the United States with the status of refugee. And they would be limited in two ways. They would have to come from South Africa, and they would have to be white. He said that. You know, a president for the last 40 years who might think it could never say that. Why does he do that? Because that's what that coalition that he's built, that's their way of handling the decline. And all that the Democrats are doing, they don't disagree. They are pushing the immigrants out. They're blaming Russia. They're blaming China. They're blaming foreign. All of that's okay. All of that's okay. The only thing they can think of is he's authoritarian, Mr. Trump. He's not doing it the way we would, which is in a quieter, more observe the democratic facade. That's all. Let me give you one example that happened 2 days ago. Kamala Harris, you know, the woman who stood for the presidency last November, she put out a tweet on the day of the announcement that Mamdani had won in New York City. She's a Democrat. Mamdani, at least legally, is a Democrat. So it's the victory of a Democrat, a young, new Democrat. Did the tweet have anything to say about Mamdani? No. No congratulation, no comment on what it might mean. Instead, it was a long tweet. It was devoted in its entirety to the matter of the death of Dick Cheney, the former vice president of who died that day, a day ago. And she commented on what a great public servant Mr. Cheney had been. This is a man whom the Democratic Party has labeled a war criminal because of the things he did in the Iraq War and all that. This is an extreme right-wing Republican, and on and on and on. She didn't comment on the success of her party. She did a eulogy of Mr. Cheney. That's a Democratic Party that is declaring war on Mr. Mamdani and everything he represents. I tell you the story because it shows you it's disintegrating here. It is simply disintegrating. Mr. Trump is believed by at least a third of his followers to be vulnerable to what is finally going to come out around the Epstein case. He will lose large numbers of people because of it. Everybody believes that. I don't know if it's true, but everybody believes it. So and he lost the election. That cannot strengthen him inside the Republicans. There are a dozen people around him who want to displace him and take his job. So you have a disintegration at multiple levels in a society whose empire is vanishing and who faces a recession any day now, becoming so big and strong that it isn't only commented on in the financial press, but on the whole general public.
It's interesting though that with the economic decline, when you see the political system disintegrate a bit, new battle lines obviously must be drawn, and this will always entail defining who we are versus the other, which you kind of made a point how this is changing both in the Democratic Party and the Republican. But what is interesting with the US, though, is it's been often quite unique in terms of having a very positive nationalism, because it's always the assumption that its best days ahead of it, because since the colonies on the East Coast going to the West, you have bipolar era, unipolar, it's always been going from strength to strength. But now that it's seeing decline, then this opened us up for the more negative nationalism. We have more of that in Europe, I guess, where you look back at a glorious past which is now gone, and you look who to blame. And of course, you see this now popping up in the US as well. That is, ideally, for US unity, just blame China and go into a new Cold War. I use the word ideally careful here. It's not a great future either, but or of course begin to turn on your own. That is, if you see the who are we versus them, if your main outgroup becomes your own people, your own political opposition, you have a problem. It just seems to me though that the Europeans they are hoping that the battle lines would be shifted in a way which we end up on the American side, because it's also interesting that Trump points to the EU, for example, as one of the people who are the worst than the Chinese in terms of taking advantage. And it is interesting that well, before you asked, you're not sure how the Venezuelan issue is covered in the European media, but it does appear to me that the Europeans, they don't really mind the idea of the US seizing control of the Venezuelan assets, especially because they're having too close relations with the Chinese and Russians. But they hope that this will be in the format of the political West, which is why I think, for example, the Nobel Peace Prize, it was almost a layup for Trump. That is, listen, here's the opposition. She wants the government toppled, but this is in the name of liberal democracy. So if you do it in the name of liberal hegemony, promote democracy, then that's the shared identity of the political West. But Trump instead went for narco-terrorism, so more American hard security. So I think they don't mind the destruction of Venezuela as long as this is, we are on the side of America in these battle lines, and instead we see the Europeans on the outside. But did you see? Do you see the U.S. Distancing itself from Europe, or just how's the relationship shifting, you think, during this political decline? And when I say America, I do realize you have different political forces.
Yes, and I wanna put my cards on the table. I'm a critic both of capitalism in general and of American capitalism, and, I believe it's a healthy society that has critics, and every system always has had them, whether they're you silence them for a while, but they're always there. So, I come from a critical perspective, and I don't have many special knowledge on, I know many of the people who run the government because the United States, contrary to the liberal democratic nonsense, is a highly stratified, prestige-ridden society. So you're talking to someone like me, comes out of my education was at Harvard, at Stanford, and Yale. If you have that for 10 years of my life, I got all the degrees I have in these institutions. My classmate in my economics program was, interesting, I blocked her name, Janet Yellen, right? So they're my classmate, and one of my teachers at Harvard was Henry Kissinger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I know I come out of that education with that part of the population. And that's the closest I come. I don't remain friends with these people, so I read the newspaper like everybody else. But here's what I would argue is going on economically. You could start in a number of places, but I'm gonna start at one because it's very dramatic and it sits in a very prominent place in their minds. We have gone in a relatively short number of years from a country with a relatively small national debt to a country with a very large national, from a few $100 billion a few decades ago to 35 trillion or whatever exactly it is right now. Uh, it is so bad that along the way, we lost our AAA credit rating from Standard and Poor, Moody's, and Fitch, the three great credit agencies in the world, which are all American, have all demoted the credit worthiness of the United States. There are other countries that have AAA. We're not one of them. Why? Because we are getting to the point that Liz Truss got to a few years ago in England, when you want to borrow a lot of money and the capital markets say to you, not going to do that. You're not, and very serious. You're so indebted that we see a risk that the mass of people are going to be mobilized by some politician, left or right, who will make the slogan, "Why are we paying interest to the billionaires of other countries rather than feeding our children?" That is a strong argument. And that's an argument you, as a creditor, probably are going to lose. And so the creditors, who include American banks, corporations, and so on, are backing away. So an incoming president has to do something about this debt. We are running deficits of excess of $1 trillion, $2 trillion a year. I mean, it is out of control. And by the way, that's itself a part of a declining empire. The corporations and the rich want the government to provide all kinds of benefits and services to them, but they don't want to pay taxes. And they support the politicians who will do that. You have the same in Europe. The mass of people, they want things from the government too, and you have loaded them up with taxes. You can't do much more of that. You'll have a revolt. If you tax corporations and the rich, you won't get the donations. If you tax the masses, you won't get the votes. So, solution, you borrow. You go to the corporations and the rich and you say, we won't tax you, but you have to lend us that money that we're not taxing. And we'll pay it back to you, and we'll pay you interest. For the rich, this is, of course, wonderful. What a wonderful choice between paying a tax and lending to the same government. So the debts go crazy because this political arrangement produces no other result, as no one should expect it would. But now you've reached the end. Like every other excessive borrower, you've run out of available more credit. Now, why do I stress that? Because Mr. Trump, whose grasp of these issues is not the greatest, and in case you're worried, let me assure you that Scott Bessent, his advisor, is right there with him. These are people with atypical, even for them, ways of thinking about economics. In any case, they came in with this idea. We are in terrible trouble. We cannot and will not tax corporations and the rich. That's out. That's a taboo. We will never do that. So what's left? How are we going to keep the system going while not borrowing crazily? And the answer is, well, it's a desperate situation. And a desperate situation, here we go now, calls for desperate measures. And that means our erstwhile allies can no longer be exempted. We exempt only our own corporations and our own rich. We know we have to take care of. But we're not doing that for the Canadians anymore, or the Mexicans, or the Europeans. Doesn't matter how close an ally you've been. Oh, Lord, we would love to take care of you the way we always have. But now, notice my language. It's this image as if we have carried them rather than ripped them off. It's all make believe, but it's the way this is set up. And it's in their minds that way. Absolutely. When Mr. Trump tells you that because there's a deficit between, I don't know, Italy and the United States, it means that Italy is abusing the United. That's the way he thinks. And instead of making fun, I mean, it's a mistake, but instead of making fun of it, try to understand where this comes from. Why is this mistake being repeated every day? Because it fits into a notion we are now going to save America by using its very size, its very importance to the British or the Dutch or the Chinese or the Japanese. They are going to have to pay us for access to the strength we have, and that's how we're going to maintain our strength. That's how we're gonna hold on to it. So we're not gonna help anybody else. You want troops in Europe, you pay for them. You want a military shield, you pay for it. You wanna fight the war in Ukraine, you pay f we're not doing this. We're not. We are husbanding our resources to get us through this difficult, period, and we're gonna take from you every nickel we can. You know, having, Ursula von der Leyen, sign a deal with the president in which she commits, if I've read this correctly and if I've made a mistake, please correct me. You're going to buy $750 billion worth of liquefied natural gas from the United States in the next 10 years, and an equal amount, about 750 billion, of investments you're committed in advance. So you're going to take money raised in the European economy and bring it over to the. You're going to be taxing your people to fund the United States. The politicians that are doing this are going to be voted out of office because they're doing this. I'm mystified how they can possibly function. How this is done in Europe, you know, I would have to interview you. You'd have to help me understand how this game of demonizing Russia and fawningly dealing with Trump, for me, I'm left wondering at the mental state of the European leaders.
Well, I think their mentality is that at the moment, yeah, Trump is throwing well, the whole chessboard up in the air, and they want when the pieces land in their place. That, as I mentioned before, that when the new battle lines are drawn, that yeah, the Americans will see the Europeans being a part of us essentially, and as you said, not extract that much wealth, but towards this end, there has to be. Well, the Europeans or the EU is are very clear that all these horrible trade deals are seen as a way of buying the affection of Washington, that they will still see a value in Europe. I think they're flawed in this assumption. I think that the more they let themselves be taken advantage of, it has two problems. One is Europe becomes even more weakened and more vulnerable, so the US is less likely to see it as an equal partner. And as the second is that Trump, I think, has a not just Trump but others as well, has a certain disdain for this kind of weakness, where there's no spine, no willingness to stand up for basic national interests. But you mentioned that the U.S. or was prepared to extract all this wealth from its own allies, but there are some exceptions, though. I mean, and there's interesting ones because Trump, of course, he got elected because he was going to do something about the debt, and I very much agree. I think that's at the heart of this. That is what makes everything unsustainable. But he would do this by ending the forever wars. He would reduce the debt, which is why I was happy with the role of Musk, just cutting everything. But now we see that a lot of the wars, they continue. Indeed, he will start some new ones, it seems. But he also donates money, though. He bails out Israel during the war and also Argentina, which is interesting. So the American government shuts down while he's helping Argentina. Now, this also looks like issues which is causing him lose a lot of support. How do you make sense of this at this critical time in American history? We're struggling with this unsustainable debt. That this is the time to bail out Argentina when Trump's own base kind of voted for him to do the exact opposite, to look after them first, America first, as he said himself.
Yeah, Mr. Trump is above all else a professional showman, we call that here. He is a performer. He understands that how you present yourself is a matter of great importance and can get you very far. He has performed himself into the White House. In other words, he's proven his own assumption in his mind. He has shown, look, I I was no student. I never understood very much. I've been a playboy all my life. I inherited hundreds of millions of dollars worth of real estate from my father. Everything has been taken care of for me. I have failed at about 8 or 9 different business ventures that he started that have collapsed. A university, bottled water, steaks, all kind casinos. It's a disaster, an endless disaster, punctuated by a history of legal entanglements that that are that are the source of humor in this culture. He's a model litigator who keeps losing, but who doesn't care because he has enough money that the point of the law is to hassle other people, to annoy them, to squeeze their funds for law so that he can use his money to make the law work for him. And he's the classic example. So why am I telling you this? If you look at the policies, there's no follow through. There's no examination of, okay, if we do this, it's going to have a negative effect over there. So we can still do it, but how do we take care of this negative so it doesn't come back and you know, undo what we're trying to do? It's the logical way a person who understands complexity goes about making decisions. You know, you have to make a decision, and it's always a risk, but you can mitigate the risk by looking, if you allow me for the moment, in a Hegelian way at the intrinsic contradictions that these acts you're undertaking. And you know that that's the way the world works. He doesn't. So when he says, I can end the war in the Ukraine with a couple of phone calls in a week, he has in his mind that as something he can do. And if he can't do it, he's going to get very angry at somebody who has intruded inappropriately, illegally, with evil intent on the good thing he's about to do. And he's flabbergasted. And he'll shoot them. It'll come to it, and he'll be entitled to shoot them because they're either ignorant or perverse or both in opposing what. So he discovers that it's not just the Europeans, it's the entire leadership of the Democratic Party and half the leadership of the Republican Party that wants to fight the war in Ukraine. And they're not going to let him do that. And there are too many of them, and they have too much of a position in this society. He can get it. He could have, but to do so, he would have had to make some concessions he didn't want to make because those he can see could hurt him. So, no, he's going to elbow them all out of the way and make a deal with Mr. Putin. That's what he's going to do. And by the way, that's not over. If the situation deteriorates, he'll probably try to do that again. And how the Russians react, I don't know. I'm sure they're thinking about it all the time. He doesn't think it through. So you point out quickly, correctly, you just bought an election in Argentina because Trump made it very clear weeks before the election that he would give a lot of money if the people voted Milei in again and would not give them the money if they didn't. No, I don't know how important that was, and I don't know how much covert activity supplemented this overt activity. But for a country that just went through a traumatic struggle over quote unquote foreign interference in our elections, you really have to stop and take a deep breath that it was as easy for Mr. Trump as it was to interfere in the Argentinian elections, and nobody here says a word. I mean, a Democratic Party that had half a brain of independence would have understood your point. Here's a chance to go to Mr. Trump's base and say, what are you doing? America first means 20 to 40 billion. And then they should have given a list of all the things Americans could have gotten for 20 to 40 billion dollars that they will not get now because we're supporting a lunatic in the power in Argentina. Would have been made to all. They didn't do it. They're caught in the same empire decline. That's not going to be that's why they don't say much about the boats. The best statements in the United States Congress against killing the people in the boats comes from a very ornery Republican politician, Rand Paul in Kentucky. He stands up and says, what the hell is this? You, you, judge, jury, and executioner, Mr. Trump, all by himself in international water. I mean, what? What? But the Democrats, listening to his speech, say nothing.
Yeah, I watched him make other comments as well, saying about 1 out of 4 of the boats which are checked for drugs are, do not have drugs, or they're, mistaken. So he said, well, if we follow the same numbers, we're, killing 1 out of 4 innocent people. Again, if it was legal to kill people in international waters before you know what's on the ship, but
In our country, we don't execute people convicted of trafficking drugs. I mean, it is.
but it is.
Let me warn you, though. Let me be a little bit. Go a little further. Europeans should think long and hard about making a decision to go with a country whose empire is falling apart, whose internal divisions are at a scale of hostility that is frightening. And with this example of the boats and the example of ICE, what it's doing internally, I mean, you're going to side with what? With the liberal democratic ideals of the past? That's the past. The only way that's going to come back is if Mr. Trump, which he is doing, if Mr. Trump produces a backlash, and Mr. Mandani, if he's smart and if he has good advisors, which my suspicion is he does, he's going to understand that his most important lever of power, right here in the financial center of Western capitalism, which is New York, where I'm sitting now, he is going to understand that he has to go, and he will go, to the head of J.P. Morgan Chase and all the other big financial institutions and say to them, you bet your money on Mr. Trump. He is now going into the toilet. And you better be very careful that the backlash against him doesn't end up putting the country in a place worse than you had it before you ever went down the road with Mr. Trump. Be very careful. The unspoken sentence, you need me. You need to have a friend on the left, because when the right wing shift turns out not to have solved the problems of the American capitalist system, you know where the working class is going to go? To the left. And let me remind everyone, the last time capitalism crashed in the 1930s, the American working class went to the left. It suddenly produced 2 socialist and 1 communist party of enormous size, who worked together with the CIO to unionized the American working class in a way it had never seen before and has never seen since. That was the peak. The 1930s produced the New Deal coalition, which generated Social Security, unemployment compensation, the first minimum wage, and public employment of 15 million Americans. Whoa. So, and how was it paid for? By taxing corporations and the rich. And who did it? A centrist Democrat, Roosevelt, who campaigned in 1932 for a balanced budget. That's what, no leftism in him, not a bit. And suddenly, whoa, that's what has to be in the back of their minds now that Mr. Mandani is giving them a shocking taste of how that can emerge right here, right in New York City. The whole leadership of the capitalist class in New York went out to stop Mr. Mandani. Michael Bloomberg gave $8 million of his own money. The head of Airbnb, the head of Home Depot. These are the billionaires of this country, pumping money in, all for nothing, all for an ignominious defeat. The election wasn't close, not at all. It was an overwhelming. And I'm right in the middle. I voted in that election because I live in Manhattan. And I know what my neighbors have all been saying to me, which I could not believe in the months coming up. I didn't believe he could do this. But my neighbors all were voting for Mandami. Jewish people, older people, young people. It just, and you know what it was? And there may be a big clue here. It wasn't in favor of socialism. Look, I would welcome that, but that was not what it was. I wish, but not. This was a vote against the status quo and anything and everything that relates to it or that sounds like it or smells like it. Mr. Cuomo, an old hack Democrat, right up there with Clinton and Obama. Nobody wants this anymore. The Republican, even worse. And what did they want? They wanted something different. And what in America could be more different than a Muslim socialist? It was like a joke, as if he were wearing a sign. You want something different? Different is over here. And people said, exactly, that's what we want.
Yeah, well, it goes back to how we started. That was when the status quo is no longer tenable, people will be willing to throw a massive wrench into the system to at least get change and break with status quo, which always reproduces itself. I think the great irony here, though, is that that's what got Trump elected because he
Yes.
said, these elites, these are not who we are. I will save you, and they did throw that wrench into the system. But now, of course, he's the one managing this economic decline, and it seems the best thing I can do is to tell people that it's actually wonderful and we're the hottest economy in the world. But as people, they realize this is not the case for them. The stock market might have gone up, but living standards continues to struggle. They will go for the next person to throw in the wrench, and that might be your new mayor.
That's right. It might be. And I can assure you that all across the United States, in every city and town, there are people like Mr. Mamdani who are now thinking of making an effort politically in their community. This is, you have let, if you allow me, the proverbial genie out of the bottle and put him back in. Not available. He's already amorphously expanding everywhere, and there aren't enough bottles, and there aren't enough people. The implications. I'm telling you, I'm just becoming aware of them, and they crowd in on me literally all day.
Well, thank you very much for letting me pick your brain. These are fascinating times to see how this economic decay, I guess, is just fueling this massive political fragmentation or even meltdown. So thank you again.
Yeah, my pleasure, Glenn. At some point, I'd love to talk with you also about Europe. You know, my father was born in France and my mother in Germany, and I have half a foot in Europe. I speak those languages. One of the most amazing things to many of us here in the United States, particularly if we have a European connection, is the decline of Europe. You know, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the French Revolution, all of the great Marxism, all of the great products of a Europe. What is happening as that part of the world shrinks? Britain is not the empire that rules the world, but a small, wet, offshore island of Europe. What's happening? Why is the United States and China talking about the world in which Europe is an afterthought? What what is this?
Well, you see this when there's political settlements being Gaza or around the world. The Europeans, they're not, if they're invited, it's to stand in the back and being mocked, essentially. And as a European, I find this to be heartbreaking to see the direction of the continent. But I've heard it to be explained as well. I spoke last week. Well, I didn't speak directly, but I was at a conference with the foreign minister of Hungary in Minsk, and he put it in the words that the Europeans have a crisis of rationality and common sense. But I would love to discuss this issue with you next week or thereafter if you're available.
Because
So thank you.
I think part of what will determine Europe's outcome is, of course, mostly Europe, but also the attitude, what's happening here as people think about Europe through the lens of the American experience. Good. So we'll talk again.